It started with one small garden gnome. Nothing flashy, nothing offensive, just a little statue tucked into my flower bed smiling quietly at the sidewalk. I didn't think twice about it until the HOA sent a notice saying it violated community standards and had to be removed immediately. So I took it out. Then my neighbor added one, then another neighbor added two. By the end of the week, there were gnomes peeking out from bushes, lining walkways and guarding porches all over the neighborhood. Because once people realized how ridiculous the rule was, they decided to have some fun with it. And that's when the HOA realized they hadn't banned a decoration. They'd inspired a neighborhood-wide gnome takeover. The gnome wasn't meant to cause trouble. I'd bought it on a weekend run to the garden center, mostly because it made me laugh. It was small, cheerful, and fit neatly between a couple of flowers in my front yard. Nothing oversized, nothing political, just a harmless bit of personality in an otherwise very neutral neighborhood. The community itself was quiet and orderly. Lawns were trimmed on schedule, houses followed the same paint palette, decorations came and went according to the calendar. The HOA preferred consistency, and most people didn't push back as long as things stayed reasonable. I'd never had a problem with them before. No warnings, no fines, no strongly worded emails. That's why the notice caught me by surprise. It arrived in my inbox late one afternoon, titled something vague about yard decor compliance. According to the HOA, my garden gnome didn't meet community aesthetic guidelines and needed to be removed within 48 hours. I reread it twice, thinking it had to be a mistake. The message didn't explain how the gnome was offensive or harmful. It didn't reference a specific rule. It just stated that decorative items must be approved and that unapproved decor could lead to enforcement action. All of this over a gnome. I stepped outside and looked at it again. It wasn't blocking the sidewalk. It wasn't distracting drivers. It wasn't even very noticeable unless you were actively looking for it. A neighbor walking their dog smiled when they saw it and said it was cute. Another joked that it made the yard feel more welcoming. That's when I realized the issue wasn't the gnome. It was that the HOA had noticed something different. And in a neighborhood where standing out was quietly discouraged, even a smiling statue was apparently too much personality. I did what the notice asked. I removed the gnome. I set it on a shelf in the garage, sent a brief reply confirming it had been taken down, and assumed that would be the end of it. It wasn't worth a fine, and it definitely wasn't worth arguing over something so small. But the next morning, something caught my eye. 2 houses down, a gnome had appeared. It stood right by the front steps, clearly visible from the street. A day later, another popped up across the road, this one holding a tiny lantern. Then another showed up near a mailbox, then another. Neighbors started talking. One asked why I'd taken mine down. When I explained the HOA notice, they laughed and said they'd never heard of such a rule. Another neighbor admitted they'd always wanted to add a little character to their yard, but didn't think it was allowed. Now they were curious. By the end of the week, the gnomes had multiplied. Some were classic, some were quirky. One wore a tiny raincoat. Another peeked out from behind a bush like it was hiding. People were clearly having fun with it, and the mood on the street changed. Neighbors lingered longer outside. Kids pointed them out as they walked by. Someone even started jokingly referring to it as the Gnome Watch. The HOA noticed. An email went out reminding residents about unapproved lawn decor and warning that violations could result in fines. The tone was firm but vague, as if written carefully to sound authoritative without actually explaining anything. Instead of slowing things down, it had the opposite effect. More gnomes appeared. They showed up in pairs, in clusters, in carefully arranged little scenes. Someone added a small sign that read, welcome. Another placed theirs right next to a flower bed, perfectly maintained and impossible to complain about without sounding petty. The HOA president began walking the neighborhood more often, clipboard in hand, photos being taken, notes scribbled quietly, but enforcing the rule became impossible. Who do you fine when half the street is involved? Who do you single out when nothing is actually being damaged or neglected? The HOA scheduled the issue for discussion at the next board meeting. That announcement spread fast. By then, this wasn't about a statue anymore. It was about how far the HOA could push over something harmless, and how many people were quietly tired of being told that even a little joy didn't fit the standard. And when the meeting finally arrived, it was clear the Gnomes weren't going anywhere quietly. The HOA meeting was unusually full. Normally, only a few residents showed up, sat quietly, and left as soon as it ended. This time, nearly every chair was taken. People stood along the walls. A few leaned against the back counter, arms crossed, clearly curious to see how this was going to play out. The Gnomes had done something nothing else ever had. They brought people to a meeting. When the HOA president opened the discussion, he went straight to the issue of unauthorized lawn decor. He talked about maintaining community standards, preserving uniformity, and preventing what he called a slippery slope of unapproved items. Then he referenced the Gnomes. He tried to frame them as clutter, as distractions, as something that could lower property values if left unchecked. That's when hands started going up. One neighbor asked which specific rule banned garden gnomes. Another asked why holiday decorations were allowed but small statues weren't. Someone else calmly pointed out that all the gnome yards were clean, maintained, and well within every landscaping guideline. The HOA president flipped through his binder. He quoted general language about aesthetics. He referenced board discretion. But every time someone asked for a specific line in the rules, he couldn't point to one. The mood in the room shifted. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't angry. It was amused. People smiled. A few chuckled quietly. Someone joked that if gnomes were banned, they'd like clarification on scarecrows next. Another board member finally spoke up and suggested the issue might not be worth enforcing. They pointed out that the decorations weren't causing damage, noise, or complaints from residents. Aside from the board itself, a motion was made to table the issue. It passed quickly. No fines, no enforcement, no deadlines. Just like that, the gnome ban disappeared. As the meeting ended, neighbors laughed and talked on their way out. Someone joked about adding tiny hats to their gnome. Another said they'd never seen the HOA back down so fast. Outside, under porch lights and street lamps, the gnomes stood exactly where they'd been, unchanged, harmless, and somehow victorious. Because the HOA hadn't lost control due to rebellion or conflict. They'd lost it because everyone finally realized how ridiculous the rules sounded once it was said out loud. The gnomes didn't disappear overnight. They stayed. Some neighbors rearranged them now and then. Others added small touches, tiny lanterns, miniature signs, even seasonal outfits when holidays rolled around. Nothing excessive, nothing messy, just quiet, harmless personality sprinkled across the street. The HOA never brought it up again. No follow-up emails, no revised warnings, no new clarifications about decor. Eventually, a few gnomes quietly vanished on their own as people moved on to other things. Some stayed put, becoming part of the yard like any other decoration. No one was pressured either way. Something subtle changed after that. Neighbors waved more. People stopped to chat. The street felt less like a checklist and more like a place people actually lived. As for me, I put my original gnome back where it started, right in the flower bed, smiling at the sidewalk like nothing had ever happened. Not as a protest, just because I liked it. The whole situation turned out to be a reminder of something simple. Rules are meant to keep things running smoothly, not to erase every bit of joy or personality. And sometimes the easiest way to push back isn't anger or confrontation. It's letting something harmless exist until everyone realizes it never should have been a problem in the first place. In the end, the gnomes didn't change the neighborhood. They just revealed it.